Welcome in. It is great to have you with us for today's deep dive.
Yeah, we are really excited to get into this one with you.
We really are. So to start us off, I want you to consider the connective tissue between ancient Aztec human sacrifices,
Okay.
Roman farmers from antiquity, and the 2026 military strikes in Venezuela.
Right, which on the surface, you were looking at totally disconnected events.
Exactly. I mean, they span thousands of years, entirely different continents, and completely different levels of technology.
But what if the underlying architecture of those three things is actually identical?
Yeah, what if it is all the same machine? Because when you lay those specific historical moments side by side, it kind of forces a complete reevaluation of how human history operates mechanically.
It really does. It asks you to look past the specific era and look purely at the transaction taking place between the people in power and the people on the ground.
And that transaction is exactly what our source material is demanding we examine today. So we are pulling from a deeply provocative blog called Knowledge is King.
Specifically, we're looking at an article published just today, March 8, 2026.
Right, by an author named Mark Wells. The piece is titled The Altars of Power, From Ancient Rituals to the 2026.
Catchy title.
Very catchy. And our mission today is to explore the text's central theory, which is that the fundamental structure of war and human sacrifice hasn't changed one bit in thousands of years.
Not at all. The argument here is that only the technology and the public relations excuses have evolved.
Right. But before we get into the actual mechanics of that theory.
Yeah, I need to step in here and make a vital clarification for you, the listener, because the source material we are examining today from Knowledge is King is intensely critical of global government.
Intensely.
It is highly critical of modern military actions and of Western economic systems. So because of the politically charged nature of these arguments, it's crucial to state that we as your hosts are not taking sides.
Absolutely not.
We are not endorsing the political viewpoints or the historical conclusions drawn by the author, whether left-wing or right-wing or anti-establishment. Our goal today is entirely impartial. We are here to synthesize and convey these arguments exactly as they are presented in the text.
Just laying it all out on the table.
Exactly, allowing you to objectively examine the specific lens through which this platform sees the world.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the way the premise is set up is genuinely gripping from a structural standpoint.
It really pulls you in.
It does. The article starts by taking us way back to the ancient world to look at the foundational setup of human society. It points out that thousands of years ago, public leaders convinced everyday families that they had to sacrifice their own sons to pagan gods.
And the way this was sold to the public was by framing it as a cosmic necessity.
A cosmic necessity. I love that phrase. The rhetoric was absolute. If you didn't offer up your children, the sun literally would not rise tomorrow.
Rains would stop.
The world would end.
And that framing of cosmic necessity is the linchpin of the entire argument here. Because behind all the incense, behind the chanting and the elaborate stone altars, the text argues that the true motive had absolutely nothing to do with the weather or the sun.
Of course not.
The actual mechanical purpose of these rituals was to maintain the absolute authority of the ruling elite and the high priests. It was purely a mechanism of control.
So, by convincing the populace that their immense, agonizing sacrifices were required for communal survival, the elite solidified their untouchable position at the top of the hierarchy.
Right. Which makes sense on a Machiavellian level. I mean, if the priests hold the keys to survival, you can't question them.
You just can't. But I do wonder, does the text frame this as a conscious conspiracy by ancient leaders, or just a dark psychological pattern that naturally evolved?
What's fascinating here is how the article treats it as a universal, almost mechanical playbook, rather than just an isolated psychological quirk.
A playbook.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah. And to prove this, the text moves into a section called The Patterns of Sacrifice Then versus Now. It uses 3 highly distinct historical case studies to show how this elite manipulation is a recurring, calculated feature of civilization.
Okay, let's get into those examples.
The first one looks at ancient Rome, specifically during the Punic Wars.
Right, the breakdown of the Roman farmers really highlights that mechanical playbook. The text describes these everyday working-class men who were drafted and sent across the Mediterranean to fight Carthage.
And the narrative they were fed, their version of cosmic necessity.
Yeah, their cosmic necessity was that this brutal deployment was required to expand the glory and the security of the Roman Empire. But the stark contrast comes when you look at what happened when the surviving veterans finally made it back home.
If they made it back.
If they made it back.
Yeah.
They returned to find that the Roman elite, the patrician class, had used their long absence to legally and economically seize their family farms.
It is brutal.
The ruling class just gobbled up the land to build massive sprawling estates, leaving the men who actually bled for Rome entirely homeless.
It is a devastating illustration of the disconnect between the ruling class and the working class. The people who stayed behind and ordered the war reaped all the material rewards, while the ones fighting lost their livelihoods.
And the second example moves us across the globe to the Aztec Empire, specifically focusing on the so-called Flowery Wars.
I have heard that term before, but the article frames them in a very specific light.
Yeah, for those unfamiliar, the Flowery Wars were these highly ritualized mock battles the Aztecs fought with neighboring states. Officially, the public was told these conflicts were sacred religious duties.
Right, they were supposedly necessary to capture prisoners, to appease the sun and war god Huitzilopochtli.
Precisely. You have to feed the god or the universe collapses.
But the text strips away the religious mythology and argues that these flowery wars were in reality highly calculated tools of political terror.
They weren't about divine appeasement at all.
Not at all. They were designed to keep neighboring nations in a constant, paralyzing state of submission. It was a way to flex military dominance and extract a horrific toll from rivals without engaging in total state-destroying warfare.
So the religious rhetoric of Huitzilopochtli was merely a cultural cloak for maintaining geopolitical dominance over the region.
Exactly.
Okay, I track with the Roman expansion and the Aztec intimidation tactics. But the third example brings us into the 20th century, looking at 1914 and the outbreak of the First World War.
This feels a bit different.
It does. Weren't the leaders of Europe literally related to each other? How does the text frame that dynamic as a calculated machine rather than just a tragic, chaotic family squabble?
That is exactly the illusion the text is trying to dismantle. The article acknowledges that millions of young men were pushed into a literal meat grinder over royal family disputes and the colonial egos of a few monarchs sitting in palaces.
Just egos.
Right, but those monarchs and politicians were the elite machine of their era. You can't tell millions of young men to go charge into machine gun fire for a cousin's bruised ego.
Or to secure a colonial trade road in Africa.
Exactly. So the public relations strategy shifted. The conflict was sold to the public as a glorious crusade to protect hearth and home. The rhetoric of patriotism and defense masked the reality of elite asset consolidation.
It is a striking metaphor when you see the pattern laid out like that. In Rome, the excuse was imperial expansion. For the Aztecs, it was religious duty. In 1914, it was defending the hearth and home.
The specific excuse changes to fit whatever the culture values most at the time.
But the underlying transaction remains completely static. The poor fight and die, and the elite consolidate their power.
And that transition of excuses brings us directly to the core of the author's thesis. The text argues that the ancient gods haven't disappeared at all. They have simply been replaced by what the article refers to as the machine.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the piece doesn't just leave us in the history books. It brings this entire framework crashing into the modern era, specifically mapping out the timeline of Western conflicts from 1989 up to today, 2026.
The argument is that the stone altars have been replaced by geopolitical boardrooms.
And the tribal high priests have been swapped out for media propagandists, think tanks, and government officials.
The defining characteristic of this modern machine is that it uses the exact same high-energy rhetoric to send young people into conflicts that exclusively serve the higher echelons.
Let's look at the modern timeline drawn here, which highlights the massive gap between the public rhetoric broadcast on the evening news and the alleged true motives operating behind closed doors.
The timeline starts in 1989 under the Bush senior administration with the invasion of Panama.
Right. The article points out that the Panama invasion was sold to the American public as an absolute moral necessity for the drug war. We had to go in to stop narcotics.
But the text argues the primary mechanical motive was actually to cement United States dominance over the Panama Canal Zone during a critical transition of power.
The timeline then moves quickly to 1991, again under Bush Sr. with the Gulf War.
The text notes how heavily this conflict was wrapped in the flag of liberation.
That was the moral imperative dominating the 24/7 news cycle. We were liberating a sovereign nation.
Yet the outcome highlighted in the article is that the war successfully laid the groundwork for a permanent, decades-long military footprint in the Middle East. It established a vital forward operating base for the machine in an oil-rich region.
Which bleeds right into the longest stretch on this timeline, 2001 to 2021. The period the text refers to as the Forever Wars, the decade spent in Iraq and Afghanistan.
And we all remember the rhetoric here.
Oh, absolutely. It was initially fueled by massive, urgent campaigns about weapons of mass destruction, and later evolved into the noble democratic goal of nation building.
But the piece aggressively contrasts that media framing with the tangible outcomes on the ground.
And those outcomes mirror the Roman farmer example almost perfectly. The article emphasizes a trail of broken, devastated families who lost their children or had them return with profound physical and psychological trauma.
Simultaneously, defense contractors, logistics companies, and weapons manufacturers were seeing absolute record-breaking profit margins.
The argument is that the wealth transfer from the working-class taxpayer to the elite boardroom via the mechanism of war is undeniable.
It really brings it up to the present moment, too. The article labels the years 2025 and 2026 as the current cycle.
It explicitly points to the ongoing military operations in Venezuela, alongside the escalating drone strikes in Iran, Somalia, and Yemen.
According to the text, the modern rhetoric used to justify these strikes revolves around the words justice and security.
But the assertion is that nothing has fundamentally changed. The cost of this so-called global security is still being paid by the people on the front lines, while the higher echelons use these precise remote conflicts to tighten their grip on the global board.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the text is making a profound statement about the illusion of technological progress.
How so?
Well, the article argues that our tools have evolved. We have moved from throwing obsidian spears to launching satellite-guided precision drones. But the human outcome is identical to the days of the Aztecs.
The distance between the boardroom and the battlefield has only grown wider, removing the elite even further from the bloodletting they initiate.
There is a really evocative, heartbreaking image used in the piece to solidify this. The text points out that the loved ones left behind today receive a carefully folded flag while the machine gains more authority.
Wow.
The folded flag is framed as the modern equivalent of the empty seized farm in ancient Rome. It is the symbolic token given to the grieving, while the elite extract the actual geopolitical power.
That is heavy. To truly understand the depth and the angle of this worldview, however, we cannot just look at this single article in a vacuum.
No, we really can't.
We have to examine the larger ecosystem of the Knowledge is King platform, because this single piece is part of a much broader, highly specific philosophical framework.
That's a crucial point. When you look at the wider publication history on the blog, you see a whole roster of recent articles posted by Mark Wells and another recurring author named Jason Wells.
Reading the connective tissue between these other pieces gives you a much clearer picture of their overall ideology. For instance, just recently there was an article titled, "The Great Disconnect, Why the Stock Market Smashes Records When Your Wallet is Empty."
Right.
The piece deeply explores how the DOW can hit all-time highs, while the cost of everyday groceries like eggs doubles.
The parallels there to the historical military argument are striking. That economic disconnect mirrors the Roman farmer dynamic perfectly.
Exactly.
Whether the mechanism is the spoils of a foreign war or the algorithmic gains of the stock market, the platform's worldview insists that the everyday person absorbs all the inflation, the risk, and the hardship, while the elite extract all the profit.
The financial system is viewed merely as another arm of the exact same machine.
Taking that a step further into the political realm, you have another article titled "The 357-65 Shield When Secrecy Becomes the Congressional Standard."
Yeah, this post provides a scathing critique of a recent vote in the House of Representatives that effectively blocked the release of internal congressional sexual misconduct reports.
Which further cements the platform's overarching theme. Western authority figures are fundamentally untrustworthy.
The argument is that they are secretive, operating entirely in their own self-interest to protect their own ranks.
They hide their misconduct behind legislative shields while simultaneously demanding total transparency, compliance, and sacrifice from the general public.
But the most defining characteristic of the Knowledge is King blog isn't just that it is anti-establishment. It has a very distinct cultural and philosophical lens.
You see titles like "Your Brain on Faith-Bridging Science in Islam," and a deeply prominent manifesto-style piece called "The Great Contradiction: Why Islam Remains the Final Frontier Against Western Hegemony."
That phrase, Western hegemony, requires some unpacking, because it is the key to unlocking the entire source material.
When the authors talk about Western hegemony, they're referring to the total cultural, economic, and military dominance of Western hypercapitalist models over the rest of the globe.
Mark and Jason Wells are clearly framing all of these geopolitical and historical arguments through a deeply Islamic philosophical perspective.
How exactly does the text bridge the ancient history lessons we just talked about with that specific Islamic perspective?
The platform positions this Islamic belief system as the ultimate resistance, the final frontier against this globalist machine. The underlying assumption here is that Western institutions are inherently predatory, built on endless consumption and the exploitation of the weak.
The authors argue that the Islamic philosophical framework operates outside of and actively resists that Western hyper-capitalist model.
They view it as a comprehensive alternative system of ethics and community that doesn't rely on the machine's endless cycle of war for profit.
You see that anti-colonial lens applied heavily in older posts, too. There's one titled The Ghost of Terra Nullius, From Colonial to Globalism.
If you're unfamiliar, terra nullius is a Latin legal term meaning nobody's land.
It was the legal concept European powers used for centuries to justify taking land from indigenous populations, claiming it was essentially empty because it wasn't being used in a capitalist Western way.
And by bringing up terra nullius alongside Jason Wells' writing on the echo chamber of ego, how superiority preys on insecurity of the platform is systematically attempting to dismantle the moral authority of Western institutions entirely.
Whether they are analyzing the military-industrial complex, the stock market, or the halls of Congress, the goal is to expose what they view as a fundamentally corrupt foundation.
So what does this all mean? Why did we bring you this specific, highly controversial source today?
This raises an important question about media consumption. Regardless of whether you personally agree or disagree with the platform's conclusions about the 2026 strikes or its views on Western hegemony, engaging with deeply opinionated material like this is a rigorous masterclass in media literacy.
It really is a powerful exercise for the critical mind.
When we read a text that challenges the mainstream accepted narrative so aggressively, it forces us to actively question the stories we are handed on a daily basis by the news and by our leaders.
It forces you to look past the press conference and ask who is actually benefiting from these systemic global decisions?
Yeah.
Who is writing the rhetoric?
Exactly. It trains us to recognize the recurring patterns of history rather than just viewing current events as isolated random incidents in a vacuum.
It demands that we ask what the actual mechanical function of a policy is beyond the noble-sounding words used to sell it.
It is entirely about seeing the architecture beneath the daily newsfeed.
So to summarize the journey the source material took us on today, the text drew a straight line from the stone altars of the Aztecs and the stolen empty farms of ancient Rome all the way to the sophisticated political rhetoric justifying precision drone strikes in 2026.
The central takeaway from the knowledge is King Blog is unapologetically clear. Until everyday people recognize the cyclical patterns of sacrifice that are constantly being demanded by the global machine, the human history is just going to continue its haunting violent loop.
The excuses will keep adapting, the technology will become more detached, but the youth will continue paying the price.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final lingering thought to explore on your own.
Okay.
The text meticulously details how the elite machine uses this incredibly powerful, noble-sounding rhetoric, words like liberation, security, cosmic necessity, to demand the ultimate sacrifice from the public.
Right.
But if this entire massive system of global power fundamentally relies on the everyday person believing the rhetoric, believing in the gods of their era, what happens when that collective belief finally breaks?
Does the machine simply collapse? Or, and this is the really chilling thought to leave you with, is the machine already quietly designing the next set of gods to replace the ones we are losing faith in today?
That is the ultimate question of the modern era.
Thank you so much for joining us for this incredibly complex, multi-layered deep dive into the patterns of history and power. We hope this exploration gave you a new lens to view the world through and some vital questions to ask the next time you hear a call for cosmic necessity. We are already looking forward to unpacking the next stack of sources with you very soon. Take care.